we're on the same slideshow that is on the classical Greece, but we're on the slide now called Cultural Influences. I'm not going to go in detail on this slide. This just is a reminder that, right, the Phoenicians brought over various knowledge and cultural elements from the Middle East, and you can see from the slide, right, different types of art and knowledge and so forth, and over time things start going transmitted back and forth. So, but the Greeks, as they rise to power and confidence in their successes against the Persians and in their growing wealth, will develop their own threads along on philosophy and art. So we'll go to the next slide. And these are humanism is a very, very key phrase that to the present day is a very, very important concept that we need to understand. Just like citizenship is so key, magic word, okay, humanism is another important one. And that's what we're going to get to. So humanism. All right. What we have is, as the Athenians especially leading the way, but the other Greeks too, amazingly they defeat the Persians and push them back, and then the Athenians become dominant over the Greeks. There's a really growing confidence in themselves, in their abilities. And what we get here is something called humanism. Now, they believe in the gods, and they believe that the gods influence events, right? If you're going on a journey, you sacrifice to the appropriate gods in order, right, perhaps Hermes, to help speed you on your journey. Or Poseidon, if you're going on a sea journey. You sacrifice the gods to help you on your journey, or help you with your crops, or whatever it is you want to do. Because if you don't anger the gods, they'll impede you. They might give you a drought or sink your ship, right? So, and even before a battle, they'll sacrifice to gods to look for the omens. And after a battle, they'll thank the gods. The gods are there, okay? But humanism, it recognizes that it's not just the gods that direct events, okay? They meddle, they involve, but they don't direct events. In other words, humanism means that basically man can achieve greatness through his own abilities. Right? The Athenian citizens achieved greatness through their hard work and efforts. The gods helped them, the gods supported them, the gods rewarded them, but it was their own efforts. Humanism puts it on man can achieve greatness himself. And this came about. And what we see is from this humanism, from this optimistic humanism, another concept that's very important is idealism. And that is the idea that there can be this sort of ideal man, or ideal of man that can be achieved, this idea of perfectibility in things. And so if you look at the classical sculptures, and I have a sculpture on here of the discus thrower, what you get is a beautifully muscular person. So it's a beautiful person with the musculature that is mathematically proportional. It actually isn't anatomically quite correct. It is mathematically proportional. That proportionality represents ideals, right? Mathematics represents perfection and ideals. So we have a mathematically proportional, idealized human being, which reflects their writings. The early writers of the Persian Wars, like Herodotus, who wrote about the early Persian Wars, write about Athens, the Athenians meeting their fate of glory through their own efforts. And, right, he's sort of got that idealism. We did it ourselves. But it's going to change over time. As you get Athenian defeat in the Persian Wars. It's going to get complicated a bit. The humanism starts to become more, especially with an Athenian writer named Thucydides, who wrote a history of the Peloponnesian War. Herodotus writes about the Persian Wars. Thucydides about the Peloponnesian War, which Athens loses. And Thucydides realized, yeah, it's humanism. Man achieves ends through his own ability, but they may not always be glory. Man can fail through his own ability. It's not just the gods didn't make us succeed. The gods are to blame necessarily for our failures either. We fail on our own. So the humanism is still man, okay? What he achieves is due to his own efforts, but that achievement may be failure as much as success. So it's less idealistic. I'm going into something which I'll look at the next slide called realism, okay? There's not necessarily some perfectible goal that we can go. So I'm going to come back to Socrates and Plato. Let me jump down a slide. And as we get into the 4th century, okay, you get more and more of this humanism from a realistic rather than idealistic perspective. So we've got very important words. Citizenship, which we had on my previous slideshow. Humanism, idealism, realism. Realism says there isn't a perfect man. There isn't a perfect concept of things. We just define and understand things as we see them. And so achieving perfectibility is a false direction to go. Do the best you can, but we're not perfect and can't be perfected. So realism, what you get is what it is. Okay, and you get a writer called Xenophon who wrote about the war between Thebes and Sparta. He was actually a mercenary who had fought in wars, and he wrote about his experiences as a mercenary. And what's interesting about Xenophon is he's more, like I said, realistic, down to earth. He tells how it happened. Right, Herodotus is saying Athens meeting its fate, its glorious fate through right, it being the good guys, and Thucydides is saying no, we messed up and we're the bad guys, and right, humanism from that perspective. Xenophon's humanist. He's looking at what people do, but he's not necessarily glorifying or even making them the bad guys. He's saying, here's what happened to us as a group of mercenaries. Here's what happened in the Sparta-Theban war. Okay, realism. Here's people doing stuff. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And I rather like the statue here, right? We've gone from the discus thrower, which is an idealized, mathematically proportional, right? And this is called the boxer. And this guy is scarred, tired, right? Waiting between fights. It's almost like the 4th century. How many wars have we had? And it's like, okay, let's wait for the next war, right? It's not negative. He's not beaten. He's just tired. He's just a man, right? Realistic rather than the purified. So we've gone from 5th century idealism to 4th century realism as they realize, right, yeah, humans, we're more complex than reaching some perfectible fate. The philosophers, and I think, I'm not going to get into great detail, philosophers are beginning to sort of follow this idea of idealism and humanism too. Socrates starts it by asking questions and saying we need to define things. It's kind of humanism. It's like human beings need to think, right? Human beings, we have reason. It's a great ability. Let's use it and ask questions. Socrates basically eventually gets put to death for asking too many questions, always a problem with philosophers. But his student Plato, and we're going into the 4th century here, he's an idealist, right? Plato thinks that there is ideals, that there are perfectible things, right? The perfect love, the perfect man, the perfect chair, perfect triangle, right? That the ideal world is perfect, and that our job is to try and understand that, what that perfection is, and try and reach it. or as close as possible. Very similar to sort of Herodotus in some ways, right? And the discus thrower. Understand perfection, try to achieve it as best as possible. But going to back to the humanism and realism slide, right, where we have Aristotle, a student of Plato. Now we're going later into the 4th century BC. And Aristotle's a realist, right? Again, going with the cultural thing, right? Philosophy, thinking, art, music, they all are all part of the culture. And the way we see the world is part of history, right? What happens in history affects how we see the world. And Aristotle's a realist. He's like, no, there aren't perfect things, okay? We classify things. We define a triangle as just something with 3 sides. We define a chair as something you sit on. We define love as this sort of set of emotions that we feel for each other. Man is a creature who walks on 2 legs and has abstract reasoning, okay? We define what things are. There isn't a perfect thing that we're a poor copy of that we want to try and perfect ourselves. We are what we are, and how we're classified is how we understand ourselves. So a realist. Yeah, Xenophon writing about his mercenaries doing stuff. Aristotle write, here's how this works, here's how that works, and not looking for perfection. So the philosophy has grown to reflect the world around them, definitely. And I'll jump to the last slide. And what we've got here, just a reminder, I've been talking about the Greek writers like Xenophon and Thucydides and philosophers like Aristotle and Plato. And there's very, very important developments. They're still a religious culture, just, with humanism. They are a religious culture. They still, like I said, sacrifice in order to see what the omens are in terms of, should we do this? Should we not do this? Can we sacrifice something to give the gods to bless us, right? Each city has its patron goddess or god. That's a mock-up of Athena, which is actually a mock-up of the Acropolis in Nashville, Tennessee. You have this great image, and yes, they were painted. We see Greek and Roman statues as these plain marble things. That's just because all the paint and gilt and stuff has worn off over the millennia. They painted them up, dressed them, and you have these gods and goddesses. Usually you have various ones in various temples, but you have the one that's protecting your city, like Athena protects Athens. So, we sometimes tend to think of Greece as this society of, philosophers and writers and so forth, which it was. But it was within a what we call polytheistic, right? Poly meaning many, polytheistic, many gods society, which also believed in those gods and trying to, appease those gods and not tick them off. The Hebrew God, which we'll briefly get to later, the Christian God, right, in the Old Testament, very similar to these polytheistic gods, right? How often is that God angry and does things to people, or how often do they try to appease and please that God? And right, it's that same relationship. That's their tribal God at that time, Yahweh, and is very similar to the gods that protect the city-states, right? Keep your God happy, don't tick them off. Very, very, very parallel. So it's a complex society. But these ideas of humanism and realism and idealism, very essential developments that is built up in Greece and extremely influential today. If you look at people who think about things and write about things and look at the world, think about how humanist are they, right? If you're not humanist, then you're assuming everything is due to a god or gods rather than to people. Right, and most of us, more or less, it's a continuum, maybe more or less realistic or idealistic, depending on where we're going. So sort of very foundational here. Right, so the next slideshow is Hellenism, and I'll do one, maybe two, sorry about all the lectures, on compressing weeks of hours of lectures into like 15 minutes. Which will look at Alexander the Great. We'll look at the spread of Greek with Alexander's conquests of the Middle East. We'll look at the spread of Greek civilization across the Middle East and how it changes with that spread. And that'll be that for week 1.